much, Michelle, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to kick off. This presentation will have two parts. The first will be just an overview of the epidemiology of Ebola so that we can all know what we're talking about, and just sort of to set the stage for the rest of the event. And then I'm going to give an overview of stigmatization of infectious disease in historical context, which will also sort of set the stage, I think. So here is an electron micrograph of the Ebola virus. This is our enemy, not the people who are infected with it. It looks like a piece of spaghetti. And to give you an idea of how small this is, if this actually were the size of a piece of spaghetti, then a human hair would be the size of a California redwood tree. So it's extremely small. Viruses are the smallest forms of life. And it's just a membrane containing a strand of RNA genetic code. It enters human cells. It makes thousands of copies of itself and then leaves, and the process repeats. Ebola is a disease of mammals. It's what epidemiologists call an episodic zoonosis. So it's an infectious disease that comes to humans from the animal kingdom. This is not at all uncommon. For example, measles is a relative of the canine distemper virus. So many infectious diseases are at one point or another a zoonosis. The first known outbreak of Ebola virus was in Zaire in 1976 near the Ebola River. And Peter Piot, who's now the dean of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, was one of the virologists studying the outbreak. And he decided to name the virus after a nearby river, the Ebola River, because he didn't want the village that contained the outbreak to be stigmatized. That's an interesting prescient move on his part, because typically viruses were named after the first village or town in which the outbreak occurred. But Peter Piot chose to name it after the river. The wild animal reservoir of the Ebola virus is not known definitively. But fruit bats are the likely candidate. There have been 26 known outbreaks since 1976, and all of them have been contained away from large urban centers, with the exception of the current outbreak, the 2014 outbreak in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And this outbreak is larger than all of other 26 outbreaks combined. We believe that a single introduction from wild animals has caused this epidemic, and all subsequent spread has been person to person. So that's based on genetic analysis of the virus. And the source is hunted animal protein in Africa. And I gave a presentation on Ebola recently, and there was a lot of interest in this. It's really no different than deer or waterfowl hunting that happens all the time in the United States. People hunt wild animal protein for human consumption. There are estimates that 1 billion kilograms annually of so-called bushmeat are harvested and consumed in Central Africa. So it's not at all an unusual occurrence. It's part of people's way of life and part of people's way of putting food on the table for their families in this part of the world. And when a wild animal is, so you cannot get Ebola from food, but when a wild animal is butchered, there's contact with the blood of the animal, and if the human skin has a nick or cut, you can have a zoonosis at that point. So the signs and symptoms of Ebola are high fever, above 101.5, severe headache, muscle pain, weakness, diarrhea, vomiting, and unexplained hemorrhage, bleeding or bruising. Sometimes you hear the term Ebola hemorrhagic fever, but we prefer to call it Ebola virus disease nowadays. Frank bleeding is actually common in only a minority of cases. These symptoms are very similar to those of many other maladies, including malaria, which is very common in Central Africa. So differential diagnosis is a severe challenge in the clinical setting. Transmission of Ebola comes from direct contact of broken skin or mucous membranes with blood or body fluid of someone who's sick with Ebola, or contact with unsterilized medical instruments. Okay? So we're talking about direct contact of the body fluids of someone who's sick with the broken skin or mucous membrane of someone who's not sick yet. So it's actually not highly transmissible, despite what you may or may not have heard. There's no, unlike, for example, influenza or measles, where I could sneeze if I were infected and infect some people in the first few rows, or indeed anywhere in this room. There's no evidence of droplet or airborne transmission. So sneezing and coughing does not spread Ebola, okay? Sneezing and coughing does not spread Ebola. And despite what you may or may not have heard, there's no mutation that's in the works that's going to one day just magically transform this into a disease that's spread by the airborne route. Viruses don't change their mode of transmission overnight. People who've become sick with Ebola have been mostly healthcare workers and close contacts of people who've been sick, so we're talking family members. Transmission only occurs from symptomatic people. There is no what we call a prodrome period. So some of you in this room may have had chickenpox before there was a chickenpox vaccine, and you know that what happens is it spreads through classrooms in kindergarten and first grade, and that's because chickenpox spreads the day before the onset of symptoms. So, you know, you send your child to school thinking that he or she is well, and she's actually, or he is spreading chickenpox to other children in the classroom. That is called the prodrome period. Some viruses have it. Ebola does not. There is no prodrome period in Ebola. There are no asymptomatic spreaders of Ebola virus. There's transmission only from symptomatic people. Different viruses have different patterns of transmission. The transmission period correlates with the peak of the virus in the blood, where there's 10 to the 8th virions per milliliter of blood. There is no vaccine and there is no cure yet. They're working on it. Convalescent sera have been used to treat people. That is the blood plasma of people who have recovered from the disease, which contains millions and millions of their antibodies. And this can be used to treat, in many cases seemingly effectively, people who are sick with Ebola. And PPE stands for personal protective equipment. There's been a lot of talk in the news lately about donning and doffing of personal protective equipment. This is the very important route through which healthcare workers are protecting themselves. And there was a wake-up call, but the hospitals in this country are now, I think, very up to speed on how to deal with PPE. The incubation period is maximum 21 days. You've all heard about 21-day waiting periods. That is the maximum incubation period. That is not the mean incubation period. The mean incubation period is 7 to 10 days. And self-monitoring, but not quarantine, of those who've been volunteering in the Ebola zone and who have come back to the United States is what the medical establishment recommends. So I want to say a word about the impact. There have been, to date, almost 15,000 confirmed cases and just over 5,000 confirmed deaths in this outbreak to date. I want to give you a sense of perspective on this. The 3 affected countries have about 20 million population and 215,000 deaths in a normal year. So there's been a huge impact, and I certainly don't want to make light of the burden of disease of Ebola, but these countries have not become ghost towns. There have been 5,000 deaths this year from Ebola. These countries have 215,000 deaths from all causes in a normal year. Okay, life is going on in these countries, and you know, that's important to remember. This graphic has been making the rounds of social media. Some of you may have seen it. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the countries affected by Ebola. Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia are 3 bordering countries in the west coast of Africa. Those are the countries where Ebola is being transmitted, and nowhere else in Africa, possibly with Mali included now. But they're getting on top of that situation, I think, quite well. So we're on a tight schedule, so I want to move on to just say a few remarks about stigmatization of infectious disease over the course of history. So there's a fear of infection that people have, and therefore a fear of infected people. because they might be infectious, we believe. And it seems to me that fear brings out the worst impulses. I mean, we're going to be talking about this, I think, a lot, but I'll give you some examples. But fear seems to bring out the worst in human behavior. And the reaction to infectious disease seemed to have an uncanny overlay on pre-existing prejudices, bigotry, and discrimination that already exists in society. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of this. But that's important. It seems to me that fear generated by infectious disease outbreaks amplifies and brings in sharp relief the prejudices, discrimination, and bigotry that we already have in society. It doesn't create them de novo, typically. So, for example, in the 14th century Black Death in Europe, we have examples of this which even predate any modern concept of infectious disease caused by bacteria and viruses. It was really not understood what was causing the Black Death, but it caused, there's many documented cases of blame and discrimination, including but not limited to violent pogroms against Jews, which was associated with the Black Death. And not only Jews, but other groups, for example, Arabs living in southern Spain were also discriminated against. Here's a cartoon from 19th century America. We have cholera, and the Board of coming in on an immigrant ship, and the Board of Health is trying to keep it out. Okay, discrimination against infectious disease and discrimination against immigrants, it's like hand in glove. I couldn't even begin to list all the examples. Okay, Angel Island here on the west coast and Ellis Island on the east coast are associated in the American imagination with immigration, but they were actually quarantine stations. Okay, because we were so afraid that immigrants coming to this country were going to be bringing infectious disease. Once it was discovered that Hansen's disease was caused by an infectious agent, people with that disease were moved against their will into leper so-called colonies. Okay, before there was the advent of chemotherapy to treat that disease, and we know in fact that Hansen's disease is actually not very contagious, but we nonetheless put people in colonies and labeled them lepers when they had Hansen's disease. HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, very recently, in the memory of many people in this room. If you look at the press coverage back then, there was the so-called 4 H's. Does anyone remember the 4 H's? Haitians, homosexuals, heroin users, and hemophiliacs. And with the exception of the hemophiliacs, none of these groups were treated like victims. They were all sort of blamed for their infection. If you look at the popular accounts of the emergence of HIV, and I just want everyone to reflect on the social status of those groups in 1980s America and consider, why we sort of stigmatize these groups among all others. That's all. There's a website the Program of Public Health has put up on more information on Ebola virus disease, and I'm sure we'll have some chance for questions later.